Little girl taken from her father slept on cardboard until she met the CEO and discovered the truth. If the title touched your heart, just imagine what's coming next. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and tell us where you're watching from. David Harrison adjusted his Italian silk tie as his driver navigated through the unfamiliar neighborhood. The pristine leather seats of his Bentley, a stark contrast to the modest homes lining Maple Street. At 34, he commanded a business empire worth billions, but the crumpled letter in his jacket pocket made him feel more vulnerable than he'd ever been in any boardroom. The letter had arrived 3 months after his brother Marcus's funeral, a final revelation that shattered everything David thought he knew about his family. Marcus, his younger brother by 2 years, had always been the rebellious one, the dreamer who chose art over ambition. Their relationship had grown distant after their parents' death, reduced to holiday cards and occasional phone calls that grew increasingly rare. "David, if you're reading this, I'm gone. I need you to know about Madison. She's 7 now, living with Harold and Ruth Peterson at 847 Maple Street. They're good people, but they're getting old, and I worry about what will happen to her. She doesn't know about you yet, but she's your niece, and she deserves better than I could give her. I was too proud to ask for help while I was alive, but I'm begging you now, please find her, please take care of her. She's the most beautiful, innocent soul you'll ever meet, and she has our mother's eyes. The Petersons have all the documentation. I've left instructions with my lawyer. Don't let my pride destroy her future the way it destroyed ours, Marcus." David's hands trembled as he refolded the letter. A niece, Madison, 7 years old, and he'd never even known she existed. The guilt gnawed at him. If only he'd tried harder to maintain contact with Marcus, if only he'd pushed past his brother's stubborn independence. "We're here, sir," his driver announced, pulling up to a small, weathered house with peeling paint and a sagging porch. The modest 2-story home looked tired but well-maintained, with flower boxes that spoke of loving care despite limited resources. David stepped out, his handmade shoes clicking against the cracked sidewalk. He'd changed from his usual business attire into jeans and a sweater, hoping to appear less intimidating, but he still felt like an alien in this neighborhood. Children's voices echoed from nearby backyards, and the scent of someone's home-cooked dinner drifted through the evening air. His heart pounded as he approached the front door, adorned with a simple wreath made of dried flowers. Through the window he could see warm light spilling from what appeared to be a living room with mismatched but comfortable furniture. This was where his brother's daughter had been living, where she'd grown up without knowing she had an uncle who could have provided so much more. Before he could second-guess himself, David knocked. The sound seemed to echo in his chest, each rap against the wood marking a point of no return. Footsteps approached, slow and careful, and he straightened his shoulders, trying to project confidence he didn't feel. The door opened to reveal an elderly man with kind eyes and silver hair, probably in his 70s. He wore a cardigan that had seen better days, but his smile was genuine and welcoming. This had to be Harold Peterson. "Can I help you?" Harold asked, his voice carrying the gentle rasp of age. "Mr. Peterson, my name is David Harrison. I'm Marcus Harrison's brother. I received a letter." David's voice caught, the words feeling surreal as they left his mouth. Harold's eyes widened, and his hand moved to grip the doorframe. "Oh my goodness. David." Yes, please come in. Ruth, come quickly." He stepped aside, ushering David into the modest living room with its warm lighting and the faint scent of baked cookies. An elderly woman appeared from what David assumed was the kitchen, wiping her hands on a floral apron. Ruth Peterson was small and delicate, with grey hair pulled back in a neat bun and eyes that sparkled with intelligence despite her obvious age. When she saw David, she pressed her hand to her heart. "You came," she whispered, tears immediately welling in her eyes. "Oh, Harold, he came. Marcus said you would, but we weren't sure. Where is she?" David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Where is Madison?" "She's upstairs doing her homework," Harold explained, gesturing toward a narrow staircase. "She's such a bright little girl, David. Top of her class, always asking questions about everything. She has Marcus's curiosity, but—" He paused, studying David's face. "But she has your eyes. Strong, determined eyes." Ruth moved closer, reaching out to touch David's arm gently. "She doesn't know about you yet. Marcus made us promise to wait until you came, if you ever did. She thinks her daddy was an artist who went to heaven, and that Harold and I are her family now. How long have you been caring for her?" David asked, noticing the way Harold favored his left leg and how Ruth's hands shook slightly. 4 years now," Harold replied. "Marcus brought her to us when she was 3. He was sick even then, though he tried to hide it. Said he needed people who could give her stability while he got treatment. We fell in love with her immediately." "She's been the light of our lives," Ruth added, her voice thick with emotion. "But David, we need to talk. Harold's been having health issues, and I'm not as young as I used to be. We love Madison with all our hearts, but we worry about her future." Before David could respond, the sound of small feet on wooden stairs filled the silence. A voice, sweet and melodious, called down from above. "Grammy Ruth, was someone at the door? I finished my math homework." David's breath caught in his throat. Grammy Ruth. This little girl he'd never met was about to change everything. "Madison, sweetheart. Can you come down for a minute?" Ruth called back, her voice carefully controlled. "There's someone here who'd like to meet you." The footsteps quickened, and David found himself holding his breath. In a moment, he would meet Marcus's daughter, his niece, his family, a piece of his brother he never knew existed. His hands clenched and unclenched at his sides as he waited for his world to expand in ways he couldn't imagine. Madison appeared at the bottom of the stairs, and David's world tilted on its axis. She was small for 7, with golden blonde hair that caught the light like spun silk, and bright blue eyes that were unmistakably familiar. The same eyes he saw in the mirror every morning, the same eyes their mother had possessed. She wore a simple pink dress that had been carefully mended in several places, and her feet were bare, revealing colorful socks with tiny rainbows. "Hi," she said brightly, completely unafraid, as she looked up at the tall stranger in her living room. "I'm Madison. Are you here to visit Grammy Ruth and Grandpa Harold?" David knelt down to her level, his throat tight with emotion. Up close, he could see Marcus in her face, the curve of her smile, the way she tilted her head when curious. But those eyes, those were pure Harrison family legacy. "Hello, Madison," he managed, his voice rougher than intended. "My name is David. I'm a friend of your daddy's." Her face lit up with genuine joy. "You knew my daddy. He was the best artist in the whole world. Grammy Ruth has his paintings upstairs. Do you want to see them? And I can show you my special bedroom." Before anyone could respond, Madison had grabbed David's much larger hand in her small one, tugging him toward the staircase with the boundless energy of childhood. Harold and Ruth exchanged a meaningful glance, but followed silently as the little girl led her uncle upstairs. "This is my daddy's art room," Madison announced, pushing open a door to reveal a small bedroom that had been converted into a gallery. David's breath caught as he saw Marcus's work covering every wall. Landscapes, portraits, abstract pieces that spoke of a talent David had never fully appreciated while his brother was alive. "He was very good," David said softly, studying a painting of a sunset that seemed to glow with internal light. "Grammy Ruth says he painted one special picture just for me, but she's saving it for when I'm older." Madison chattered on, tugging his hand again. "Come see my room. I have the most special bed in the whole world." She led him to a tiny adjacent bedroom, barely large enough for basic furniture. David's eyes took in the scene: a small dresser with carefully folded clothes, a shelf with well-loved books and a few modest toys, and in the corner. "This is my special bed," Madison announced proudly, gesturing to what was clearly a makeshift sleeping arrangement. Large pieces of cardboard had been carefully arranged and covered with blankets and a small pillow. "Grandpa Harold helped me make it. It's like camping every single night." David felt his knees go weak. The innocent pride in her voice, the genuine happiness on her face as she showed off her cardboard bed as if it were a treasure. It shattered something fundamental inside him. Behind him, he heard Ruth's sharp intake of breath. "See? I can pretend I'm camping in the forest or on a pirate ship or even on a cloud." Madison bounced on the cardboard, which crinkled under her weight but held together. "Sometimes when it storms, I pretend I'm in a cave staying safe from dragons." "Madison, sweetheart," Ruth's voice was strained, "why don't you go get ready for your bath while I talk to Mr. David?" "Okay, Grammy, it was nice meeting you, Mr. David. Will you come visit again? Maybe next time you can tell me more stories about my daddy." As Madison skipped out of the room, humming to herself, David remained frozen, staring at the cardboard bed. The careful arrangement, the way the blankets were tucked just so, the small stuffed rabbit that clearly served as her only bedmate. It painted a picture of poverty maintained with love and dignity. "David," Harold's voice was gentle but firm, "we need to explain." They returned to the living room, where Ruth immediately began preparing tea with shaking hands. David noticed the worn carpet, the furniture that had clearly been second-hand when purchased decades ago, the way the lampshades had been carefully repaired multiple times. "How long has she been sleeping on cardboard?" he asked, his voice barely controlled. "About 6 months, Ruth admitted, settling into her chair with obvious joint pain. "Harold's disability payments were reduced, and with my medical bills, we had to sell her proper bed to pay for my heart medication." David's hands clenched into fists. "Why didn't you reach out?" "The lawyer Marcus mentioned. Didn't he leave any provisions?" Harold shook his head sadly. "Marcus had more heart than money, son. He left us what he could, but it wasn't much. His medical bills from the cancer treatment ate up everything. We've been making do, but we're not making do anymore," Ruth interrupted, her voice breaking. "Harold had another episode last week. The doctors say his heart is failing, and with my condition." She looked toward the stairs where Madison had disappeared. "We love that little girl more than life itself, but we can't give her what she needs much longer." David pulled out his phone, his business instincts kicking in even as his heart broke. "I'm calling my lawyer. Tonight. We're going to fix this." "David, wait," Harold said urgently. "It's not that simple. Madison doesn't know about you, about Marcus having family. She's been through so much change already. If you're going to be part of her life, it has to be done carefully. She's not a problem to be solved with money." The rebuke stung, because it was accurate. David was already thinking in terms of solutions and resources, rather than the emotional needs of a traumatized child. He put his phone away and ran his hands through his hair. "You're right. I'm sorry. Seeing her like that, so happy with so little, while I have more than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. She's happy because she's loved," Ruth said firmly. "Money can't replace that, David. But love and security together, that's what she really needs." Over the next hour, Harold and Ruth shared Madison's story. How Marcus had brought her to them as a toddler, already sick but trying to hide it. How they'd watched her grow from a scared little girl into a bright, curious child who brought joy into their aging home. How they'd struggled to provide for her, while dealing with their own declining health, always putting her needs first, even when it meant sacrificing their comfort. "She asks about other children sometimes," Ruth confided. "Wonders why she doesn't have birthday parties like the kids at school, why she can't join the soccer team or take dance lessons. We've tried to explain that some families are different, but she's getting old enough to notice the differences. What does she know about Marcus? David asked. That he was her daddy, that he loved her very much, and that he's in heaven now, Harold replied. She has his artist's eye, always drawing, always creating stories. But she doesn't know anything about your family, about the business empire you've built, about the life she could have. David looked around the modest living room again, seeing it through new eyes. Despite the worn furniture and obvious financial constraints, there was love here. Photographs of Madison covered every surface, school pictures, candid shots of her helping in the garden, artwork she'd created that had been carefully framed and displayed with pride. I want to be part of her life, he said finally, but I need to understand. What would that look like? How do we do this right? Before Harold could answer, Madison's voice echoed down from upstairs. Grammy Ruth, can Mr. David stay for story time? I want to show him the book about the princess who builds castles. Ruth's eyes filled with tears again. She's already attached to you, she whispered. That's how she is, open heart, quick to love. But David, if you're going to be part of her world, you can't just visit when it's convenient. She's lost too much already. David nodded, understanding the weight of the commitment he was considering. This wasn't just about providing financial support. This was about becoming family to a little girl who had already experienced abandonment and loss. I'll stay tonight, he said, for story time, and so we can figure out how to move forward together. And that evening marked the beginning of David's transformation from successful businessman to something he'd never planned to become: family. After Madison's bath, he found himself sitting on her bedroom floor, her small form curled up on the cardboard bed as she showed him her collection of library books. This one is my favorite, she said, holding up a worn copy of The Princess and the Garden. It's about a princess who doesn't live in a castle, but she makes everything beautiful anyway, just like Grammy Ruth makes our house beautiful. David opened the book, noting how carefully it had been handled despite obvious repeated readings. As he began to read aloud, Madison scooted closer, her head eventually finding its way to rest against his arm. The trust was immediate and complete, and it terrified him. Mr. David, she said sleepily as he finished the story, do you think my daddy can see me from heaven? The question hit him like a physical blow. David looked down at this small person who had already endured more loss than many adults, and he made a decision that would change both their lives forever. I think he can, David said softly, and I think he's very proud of what a smart, kind little girl you've become. I miss him sometimes, Madison admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't remember much, but I remember his hands when he painted. They were always covered in colors. After Madison fell asleep, David, Harold, and Ruth sat in the kitchen, speaking in hushed tones over cups of coffee that had long grown cold. The reality of their situation was stark. Harold's latest cardiac episodes were becoming more frequent, and Ruth's arthritis and heart condition were making it increasingly difficult for her to keep up with an active 7-year-old. We've been talking about contacting social services, Harold admitted reluctantly. Not because we want to give her up, but because we're afraid of what will happen if something happens to us suddenly. She'd go into the system, Ruth added, her voice breaking. Foster care at best. She's been through enough, David. She deserves stability. David had made his decision hours ago, but hearing the desperation in their voices solidified his resolve. I want to file for guardianship, he said, with your support, if you're willing to give it. Harold and Ruth exchanged a long look, having one of those silent conversations that only couples married for decades could manage. What kind of life would you give her? Ruth asked finally. You're a busy man, David, a powerful man with responsibilities. Madison isn't a business acquisition. She's a little girl who needs consistency, attention, and love. I know, David said. I've been thinking about that all evening. I'd need to make changes, significant ones. Maybe move her closer to my home, or... He paused, struck by a sudden realization. Or move closer to her, keep her in the same school, the same neighborhood where she's comfortable. You'd do that? Harold asked, surprise evident in his voice. She's lost enough, David replied, echoing Ruth's earlier words. I won't be the reason she loses more. They talked until well past midnight, working out the practical details. David would begin the legal process immediately, but they agreed that the transition needed to be gradual. Madison would stay with Harold and Ruth, while David established himself as a presence in her life. When the time came for him to take full responsibility, it would feel natural rather than traumatic. There's something else, Ruth said as David prepared to leave. Madison's going to ask questions about you, about why you're suddenly in her life. She's smart, David. How do we explain this without overwhelming her? We tell her the truth, age-appropriately, David decided, that I'm her daddy's brother, that I've been looking for her, and that I want to be part of her family. The next morning brought new challenges. David had called his assistant before dawn, rearranging his entire schedule for the week. He returned to the Peterson house with bags from the local grocery store and a determination to make Madison's life better in every way possible. Madison greeted him at the door with a smile that could have powered the entire neighborhood. "Mr. David, you came back! Grandpa Harold said you might visit again soon, but I didn't know it would be today. I brought breakfast," David said, holding up the bags. "And I was hoping you might show me more of your drawings." Over pancakes that Madison helped flip, with mixed results, David learned more about his niece's daily life. She attended Maple Elementary, where she was in 2nd grade and consistently at the top of her class. Her teacher, Mrs. Thompson, had mentioned Madison's exceptional artistic abilities and her gift for storytelling. "I write stories too," Madison explained, syrup on her chin, "about adventures and magic and families that find each other." The innocent statement hit David with its prescience. Families that find each other, exactly what was happening between them. "Madison," David said carefully, "I have something important to tell you. You know how I said I was a friend of your daddy's?" She nodded, suddenly serious, as if sensing the importance of the moment. "Well, I'm more than just a friend. I'm your daddy's brother. That makes me your uncle." Madison's eyes widened and she set down her fork. "My uncle? Like in the stories? A real uncle?" "A real uncle," David confirmed. "I've been looking for you for a long time, ever since I found out about you. And if it's okay with you, I'd like to spend more time getting to know you." "Does that mean you're my family too?" she asked, her voice filled with wonder. "Yes, sweetheart. It means you have more family than you knew about." What happened next would stay with David for the rest of his life. Madison climbed down from her chair, walked around the table, and wrapped her small arms around his waist in a hug that felt like coming home. "I always wished I had more family," she whispered against his sweater. "Daddy used to say that love makes family, not just blood. Do you love me, Uncle David?" The question was asked with such innocent directness that David felt his carefully constructed emotional walls crumble completely. Looking down at this remarkable little girl who had just accepted him into her world with open arms, he realized that love wasn't something that grew over time. Sometimes it struck like lightning, immediate and transformative. "Yes, Madison," he said, his voice thick with emotion as he hugged her back. "I love you very much." From the kitchen doorway, Harold and Ruth watched the scene with tears in their eyes, knowing they were witnessing the beginning of something beautiful, the formation of a new family built on love, loss, and the courage to start over. The rest of that morning unfolded like a dream David never knew he wanted. Madison insisted on showing him her entire world, her collection of smooth stones from the backyard, her library books stacked carefully by reading level, the small garden patch where she and Ruth grew tomatoes and sunflowers. Each revelation was presented with the kind of proud ownership that only children possess, as if she were sharing state secrets. "And this is where I practice my letters," Madison announced, leading David to a corner of the living room where a child-sized desk sat beneath the window. The surface was covered with carefully practiced alphabet sheets and drawings of houses with elaborate families standing in front of them. David noticed that in every drawing, the families had at least 4 people, sometimes more. "You're an excellent artist," David said, studying a picture of a house with smoke curling from the chimney and flowers lining the walkway. "Just like your daddy." Madison beamed at the comparison. "Grammy Ruth says I have artist eyes. She says that's why I notice things other people don't notice." "Like what?" David asked, genuinely curious. Madison considered this seriously, her small brow furrowed in concentration. "Like how Grandpa Harold holds his chest sometimes when he thinks nobody's looking, and how Grammy Ruth counts pills twice before she takes them, and how you look sad even when you're smiling." The observation hit David with unexpected force. This 7-year-old had seen through his carefully constructed composure in less than 24 hours. "You do have artist eyes," he agreed softly. "What else do you notice?" "Your shoes cost more than our grocery money," Madison said matter-of-factly, without judgment. "And your watch is the kind Grammy Ruth points to in magazines and says, 'Land sakes,' but you sat on my floor without caring about getting your fancy clothes dirty, so I think you're the kind of rich person who's still nice inside." Harold, who had been listening from the kitchen doorway, chuckled. "Out of the mouths of babes," he said, joining them in Madison's corner. "She's got quite a way of seeing straight to the heart of things." "Madison," David said carefully, "how would you feel if I wanted to spend more time with you? Maybe come visit every day, help with homework, take you places?" Madison's face lit up like Christmas morning. "Every day, really? Could we go to the art museum? Grammy Ruth showed me pictures in a book, and I want to see the paintings that are bigger than me." "We can go anywhere you want," David promised, already mentally rearranging his schedule around school hours and bedtime stories. The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the front door. Harold went to answer it, returning with Mrs. Thompson, Madison's second-grade teacher, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and the patient demeanor of someone who genuinely loved working with children. "I hope I'm not intruding," Mrs. Thompson said, "but Madison didn't turn in her reading log yesterday, which is unusual for her. I wanted to check." She stopped mid-sentence when she saw David, clearly not expecting to find a stranger in the Peterson home. "Mrs. Thompson!" Madison jumped up and ran to her teacher. "This is my Uncle David. He's my daddy's brother, and I just found out about him yesterday, and he's going to take me to see big paintings." Ms. Thompson's expression shifted from surprise to something more complex, a mixture of relief and concern that David was beginning to recognize as the look adults gave when they realized Madison's situation was more complicated than it appeared. "Your uncle," Mrs. Thompson repeated, looking between David and Madison. "How wonderful that you've connected with family, Madison." David stood, extending his hand. "David Harrison. I apologize for the confusion. This is all very new for all of us." "Harrison," Mrs. Thompson repeated, and David saw the moment recognition dawned. "David Harrison, as in Harrison Industries?" "Harrison." "Yes," David confirmed, wondering how his business reputation would affect Madison's teacher's perception of this situation. Mrs. Thompson's demeanor shifted to something more formal. "Mr. Harrison, might I speak with you and the Petersons privately for a moment?" Madison, sensing adult conversation coming, sighed dramatically. "I'll go work on my reading log," she announced, "but I want to hear about the museum trip when you're done talking about grown-up stuff." Once Madison was settled at her desk with her book, Mrs. Thompson spoke in low, careful tones. "Mr. Harrison, I need to understand what's happening here. Madison is one of my brightest students, but she's also shown signs of adjustment issues. She's very mature for her age, sometimes too mature. She worries about things children shouldn't have to worry about." "What kind of things?" David asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. "Money, mostly. She's mentioned several times that she doesn't want to be expensive. Last month, she turned down a field trip because she said it cost too much. When we have classroom parties, she always brings something homemade instead of store-bought, and she's very careful about using supplies, as if she's worried about waste." David felt his heart constrict. Madison had learned to make herself small, to minimize her needs, to avoid being a burden. How many 7-year-olds worried about being too expensive? "There's something else," Mrs. Thompson continued. "Madison talks about her family differently than other children. She's very protective of the Petersons, almost parental in how she describes taking care of them. When Harold had his episode at school pickup 2 weeks ago, Madison was the one who stayed calm and told me to call Ruth. She has their medical information memorized." Harold's face flushed with embarrassment and guilt. "She shouldn't have to carry those burdens," he said quietly. "No child should," Mrs. Thompson agreed, "but Madison has adapted by becoming incredibly responsible and self-sufficient. The question is, Mr. Harrison, how will this change affect her? She's built her identity around being helpful and undemanding. If her circumstances change dramatically..." David understood the implication. Madison might struggle with receiving care and attention after years of learning to minimize her own needs. "What would you recommend?" David asked. "Consistency, patience, and understanding that she may resist help initially. Madison has learned to find security in being needed rather than in being cared for. Changing that pattern will take time." After Mrs. Thompson left, David found himself observing Madison with new eyes. She approached him with her completed reading log, but instead of simply showing her work, she asked if he wanted her to read aloud to him. "Would you like me to read to you?" David offered instead. Madison looked surprised by the suggestion. "Don't you have important work to do?" "You are my important work," David replied, settling beside her on the small couch. As he read to Madison, David noticed how she positioned herself, close enough to see the pages, but ready to jump up if needed, always aware of her surroundings. She listened intently, but also kept one ear tuned to the sounds from the kitchen, where Ruth was moving more slowly than usual. "Uncle David," Madison said during a pause in the story, "are you going to change things?" The question was loaded with more meaning than a 7-year-old should have to convey. "Some things will change," David said honestly, "but not the important things. You'll still live here with Grammy Ruth and Grandpa Harold. You'll still go to the same school, have the same friends, but maybe you won't have to worry about some of the things you've been worrying about." "Like money?" Madison asked with characteristic directness. "Like money," David confirmed. Madison was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. "Will Grammy Ruth and Grandpa Harold still need me to help them?" David understood now that Madison's sense of purpose was tied to being useful, being needed. Taking that away would be like removing a foundation stone. "They'll always need you, sweetheart," David assured her, "but maybe they won't need you to worry so much. There's a difference between helping because you love someone and helping because you have to." "What's the difference?" Madison asked. "When you help because you love someone, you do it because it makes you happy to make them happy. When you help because you have to, you do it because you're scared of what might happen if you don't." Madison considered this with the seriousness of a philosopher. "I help Grammy Ruth and Grandpa Harold because I love them," she said finally. "But sometimes I also help because I'm scared they might get too tired and not be able to take care of me anymore." The honest admission broke David's heart. This little girl had been carrying adult fears and responsibilities while still learning to tie her shoes and subtract two-digit numbers. "Madison," David said gently, "part of my job as your uncle is to make sure you don't have to be scared about things like that anymore. You can help Grammy Ruth and Grandpa Harold because you love them, and I'll take care of the scary stuff." "What if something happens to you too?" Madison asked, her voice very small. David realized that Madison's previous losses had taught her that adults disappeared, sometimes suddenly, sometimes permanently. Promising to stay wouldn't be enough. He needed to show her through consistent action that some people could be counted on. "I'm going to be here every day," David said. "And even when I'm not physically here, I'm going to be part of your life in ways that don't disappear. Would you like to call me tomorrow morning, before school? We could make it our special routine." Madison's face brightened. Every morning, and maybe every afternoon I could pick you up from school, and we could have a snack and do homework together." "What about your important business work?" David looked at this remarkable little girl who had already rearranged his priorities without even trying. "I'm learning that there are different kinds of important work," he said, "and right now, being your uncle is the most important work I've ever had." That afternoon, David experienced his first taste of what daily life with Madison would be like. She showed him how to make peanut butter sandwiches the Ruth way, cut diagonally with the crusts left on because waste not, want not. She explained her homework routine. Math first because it was hardest, then reading, then any creative projects. She introduced him to her afternoon ritual of watering the plants and checking on the small garden she maintained with Ruth. "I'm growing sunflowers," Madison explained, pointing to small green shoots barely visible above the soil. "Grammy Ruth says they'll be taller than me by summer. Do you think you'll still be here when they bloom?" "Wild horses couldn't keep me away," David promised, meaning it more than he'd ever meant anything. As the afternoon wore on, David found himself marveling at Madison's small rituals and routines. She approached everything with deliberate care, folding her school clothes just so, arranging her library books in order of preference, setting out her clothes for the next day before beginning her bedtime routine. "She's always been like that," Ruth observed, watching Madison organize her backpack for tomorrow. "Everything in its place, everything planned ahead. It's partly her personality, but partly." She didn't finish the sentence, but David understood. Madison had learned that chaos meant insecurity, that small controls helped manage big uncertainties. "Grammy Ruth," Madison called from the living room, "is it okay if Uncle David stays for dinner again? I want to show him how I help cook." David looked questioningly at Ruth, who smiled and nodded. "She's been asking for weeks if we could have company for dinner," Ruth whispered. She wanted to show someone how grown up she's gotten at helping in the kitchen. Dinner became another revelation. Madison knew where everything was kept, how Ruth liked the table set, which foods needed to be cut smaller for Harold's easier chewing. She moved through the kitchen like a small adult, anticipating needs and filling gaps before being asked. "Madison," David said as they worked together to clear the dishes, "you're an amazing helper. But you know it's okay to just be a kid sometimes too, right?" Madison looked puzzled by the concept. "What do you mean?" "I mean, it's okay to play without thinking about chores. It's okay to make messes sometimes. It's okay to need help instead of always giving help." "But if I don't help, who will?" Madison asked, genuinely confused. David knelt down to her level, understanding that this conversation was crucial. "Lots of people will help. Me, Grammy Ruth, Grandpa Harold, your teacher, your friends. Madison, you don't have to earn your place in this family by being useful. You belong here just because you're you." Madison stared at him with those two wise blue eyes, processing this radical concept. "Even if I'm not helpful? Even if you're not helpful? Even if you make mistakes?" Even if you have bad days, or get scared, or need someone to take care of you, you're part of this family no matter what. That evening, as David prepared to leave for his hotel, Madison presented him with a drawing she'd been working on during quiet moments throughout the day. It showed the Peterson house, but now there were 4 figures in the front yard: Grammy Ruth, Grandpa Harold, Madison, and a tall figure labeled Uncle David. "This is for you," Madison said shyly, "so you can remember that you have a family here." David looked at the drawing, at this little girl who had spent the day showing him not just her world, but teaching him what mattered in a way no business school or board meeting ever could. "Madison," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I think you're the one who's teaching me about family." As he drove back to his hotel that night, David realized that his life had been fundamentally altered in ways he was still discovering. He'd built an empire, commanded respect from world leaders, and accumulated wealth beyond most people's dreams. But none of it had prepared him for the fierce protectiveness he felt for a 7-year-old who worried about being too expensive and cut sandwich crusts to avoid waste. Tomorrow, he would begin the process of rebuilding his life around Madison's needs. But tonight, he fell asleep holding her drawing and planning their trip to see paintings bigger than her, understanding for the first time that some acquisitions couldn't be measured in dollars, and some successes couldn't be quantified in quarterly reports. But even as David held his niece's artwork and made silent promises about the future he would give her, none of them could have predicted the challenges that lay ahead, or the unexpected person who would soon join their expanding family circle and change everything once again. 3 weeks into what had become David's new routine of daily visits to Maple Street, reality arrived in the form of Victoria Chen, a social worker from the Department of Children and Family Services. David was helping Madison with her math homework when the knock came, firm and official in a way that made Harold's face go pale. "Mr. Peterson." Victoria introduced herself, her professional smile not quite masking the concern in her dark eyes. She was perhaps 30, with an air of competence that spoke of someone who'd seen too much in her line of work. "I'm here regarding Madison Harrison. We received a report about her living situation." David stood slowly, his business instincts kicking in even as his heart sank. Someone had called social services, a neighbor, a teacher, someone who'd noticed the changes in the household as he'd become a regular presence. "Uncle David, who is the lady?" Madison asked, looking up from her worksheet with curious eyes. Over the past 3 weeks, she'd taken to calling him Uncle David with such natural ease that it broke his heart every time. "Madison, sweetheart, why don't you go help Grammy Ruth in the kitchen?" David suggested gently, but Victoria shook her head. "Actually, I'd like Madison to stay if that's all right. Children often provide the most honest perspective on their own situations." Victoria settled into Harold's worn armchair, pulling out a tablet and a file thick with documents. "Madison, I'm Victoria. I work with families to make sure children are safe and happy. Can you tell me about your family?" "I have the best family," Madison announced proudly. "Grammy Ruth and Grandpa Harold take care of me, and now I have Uncle David too. He's my daddy's brother, and he brings me books and helps with homework, and yesterday he taught me how to paint watercolors, just like Daddy used to." Victoria made notes, her expression carefully neutral. "That sounds wonderful." "And where do you sleep, Madison?" "In my special camping bed upstairs. It's made of cardboard, and it's like an adventure every night." Madison's enthusiasm was genuine, but David watched Victoria's expression tighten almost imperceptibly. After Madison skipped back to the kitchen, Victoria's professional mask slipped slightly. "Mr. Harrison, and it is Mr. Harrison, correct? The billionaire CEO David Harrison." "Yes," David admitted, unsure whether his wealth would help or hurt in this situation. "And you're just now discovering your 7-year-old niece who's been sleeping on cardboard for 6 months?" Victoria's tone remained professional, but the judgment was clear. Can you explain why a man of your resources wasn't aware of this child's existence? What followed was the most difficult conversation of David's life. He explained about Marcus's pride, their estranged relationship, the letter that arrived 3 months after the funeral. Victoria listened, occasionally interrupting with pointed questions about legal guardianship, financial support, and David's intentions. Mr. Harrison, I need to be direct. Madison is currently in an unstable situation. Mr. and Mrs. Peterson are wonderful people, but they're elderly and dealing with serious health issues. You claim to want guardianship, but you've been in her life for less than a month. What happens when your business demands your attention? When the novelty of having a niece wears off? That won't happen, David said firmly. But Victoria's skeptical look suggested she'd heard similar promises before. I need documentation, Mr. Harrison. Proof that you're Madison's uncle, evidence of your brother's wishes, character references, financial statements, background checks, and I need to understand why Marcus Harrison chose to hide his daughter from her only living relative. That evening, after Victoria left with promises to return in a week for follow-up interviews, David found himself in Marcus's old art room with Harold, sorting through boxes of his brother's belongings that had been stored in the garage. They were looking for answers about Marcus's decisions, about Madison's mother, about the 4-year gap in David's knowledge of his niece's existence. Here, Harold said, pulling out a wooden box from beneath a stack of canvases. Marcus asked me to keep this safe, said if anything happened to him, it might be important someday. Inside the box were documents, photographs, and several more letters in Marcus's familiar handwriting. David's hands shook as he opened the first envelope, addressed simply, "For David, if he ever asks about Sarah." Sarah, Madison's mother, had a name. David, if you're reading this, you probably want to know about Sarah Mitchell. She was beautiful, David, inside and out. An art teacher at the community college where I was taking classes. We fell in love fast and hard, the kind of love that felt like it could conquer anything. When she got pregnant with Madison, we were terrified but happy. We were going to get married after the baby came, start our family properly. But childbirth complications took her from us. She died holding Madison for just 10 minutes, long enough to name her, long enough to make me promise I'd give our daughter the best life possible. I was 26, David, with no money, no career, and a newborn daughter who'd already lost her mother. I thought about calling you then. I thought about it every day for months, but every time I picked up the phone, I remembered how you looked at me the last time we fought, like I was a failure, like I'd never amount to anything. How could I admit that I needed help? How could I prove that I was capable of being a father when I couldn't even take care of myself? I spent Madison's first 3 years trying to make it work alone. I took whatever jobs I could find, painted houses and portraits for grocery money, moved from apartment to apartment when I couldn't make rent. Madison deserved better, but my pride was bigger than my love for her. That's the truth I can barely live with. When I got the cancer diagnosis, I knew I was out of time. The Petersons were the kindest people I'd ever met, customers who'd become friends. They offered to help when they saw how sick I was getting, and Madison loved them immediately. But even then, I was too proud to call you. Too afraid you'd try to take her away from the only stable home she'd ever known. I know I was wrong, David. I know I robbed you of knowing her, robbed her of having her real family. I know the Petersons won't be able to care for her forever. But she's so happy with them, so loved. Please don't let my mistakes destroy the stability she's finally found. She doesn't need rescuing, David. She needs family who will love her as much as they provide for her. There are legal documents in this box. I made sure Madison's guardianship could transfer to you if the Petersons can't continue. Sarah's parents wanted nothing to do with us after she died, said we were too young, too poor, that the pregnancy killed their daughter. Don't let them find out about Madison. They have money and lawyers, and they blamed me for Sarah's death. They could try to take her. Love her, David. She's the best of both Sarah and me, but she has your strength, your intelligence. She's going to change the world someday if someone gives her the chance. Tell her about her mother when she's ready. Tell her Sarah would have been proud. Marcus. David set the letter down with trembling hands. Harold was watching him with knowing eyes. You knew, David said quietly. You knew about Sarah's parents. Marcus was terrified of them, Harold confirmed. They showed up at Sarah's funeral with lawyers, tried to claim Madison should be with them instead of Marcus. Only reason they didn't succeed was because Sarah had already named Marcus as father on the birth certificate, and they had no proof he was unfit. Are they still alive? Still a threat? Sarah's mother died 2 years ago, but her father, Richard Mitchell, is very much alive. He's a federal judge, David. Rich, powerful, and he never forgave Marcus for what he saw as corrupting his daughter. If he finds out, Madison exists. The conversation was interrupted by Madison's voice from the kitchen. Uncle David, Grammy Ruth says you're staying for dinner. Can we have pancakes again? David looked at the legal documents spread before him, at the photographs of a young woman with Madison's smile holding a newborn baby, at the evidence of his brother's love and devastating pride. Tomorrow he would call his lawyers. Tomorrow he would begin the process of legal guardianship and background checks and proving himself worthy of caring for his niece. But tonight he would have pancakes with his family and pretend that love was enough to solve everything, because Madison's happiness in this moment mattered more than the battles that lay ahead. Victoria returned a week later with a full team, another social worker, a child psychologist, and a family court representative. David had spent the intervening days building his case with the precision he usually reserved for corporate acquisitions, but this felt infinitely more important and terrifying. He'd moved into a hotel nearby rather than commuting from his penthouse apartment, wanting to be available for Madison's school pickup and bedtime stories. His assistant had been fielding increasingly urgent calls from board members, wondering why their CEO had suddenly become unreachable most evenings. Mr. Harrison, Victoria began, settling into the Petersons' living room with her clipboard and tablet. We've completed your background checks and financial assessments. Everything appears to be in order from that perspective. Madison was at school, which David was grateful for. These conversations were becoming increasingly adult and complicated. However, Victoria continued, we have some concerns about the practicality of this arrangement. Madison has never lived anywhere but this neighborhood. Her entire world is within a 6-block radius, her school, her friends, the Petersons. Are you prepared to maintain that stability? I've been looking at houses in the area, David replied. I want to keep her in the same school, the same community. I understand that consistency is crucial for her emotional well-being. Dr. Sandra Williams, the child psychologist, leaned forward. Mr. Harrison, I've spent time with Madison this week, both here and at school. She's a remarkably well-adjusted child, considering her losses, but she's also showing signs of anxiety about change. She's mentioned several times that she's worried about Uncle David going away like Daddy did. The words hit David like a physical blow. Of course, Madison would fear abandonment. Everyone she'd loved had left her, either by death or circumstance. What can I do to help her feel more secure? He asked. Consistent presence, predictable routines, and honest communication about your intentions, Dr. Williams replied. Children Madison's age understand more than we often give them credit for. She needs to know what's happening and why. The conversation was interrupted by an unexpected knock at the door. Harold answered, and David heard him speaking in hushed, urgent tones with someone outside. When Harold returned, his face was ashen. David, there's a man here who says he's Madison's grandfather, Richard Mitchell. The blood drained from David's face. Sarah's father, the federal judge who had blamed Marcus for his daughter's death, was standing on the Petersons' front porch. Richard Mitchell was exactly what David had expected. Tall, distinguished, with silver hair and the bearing of a man accustomed to authority. He wore an expensive suit and carried himself with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no. "Mr. Harrison, I presume." Mitchell's voice was cultured and cold. "I understand you've been inserting yourself into my granddaughter's life." "Your granddaughter?" Victoria interrupted, her professional instincts clearly triggered. "Mr. Mitchell, are you claiming kinship to Madison Peterson?" "Madison Harrison," Mitchell corrected firmly. "My daughter Sarah died giving birth to her 7 years ago. I've recently become aware that the child survived and has been living in these circumstances." His gaze swept dismissively over the Petersons' modest home. David stood, every business instinct in his body screaming danger. "Mr. Mitchell, with respect, you've had 7 years to establish a relationship with Madison. You can't suddenly decide. I can't suddenly decide to care for my own flesh and blood." Mitchell's eyebrows rose. "Mr. Harrison, I'm a federal judge with a stable home, a devoted wife, and resources to provide Madison with every advantage. Can you say the same?" "I can say that I love her," David replied, his voice steady despite the fury building in his chest. "Can you?" Before Mitchell could respond, the sound of a school bus outside announced Madison's arrival. Through the window, David could see her skipping up the walkway, backpack bouncing, completely unaware that her world was about to be turned upside down again. "Uncle David!" Madison burst through the door, stopping short when she saw the room full of adults with serious faces. "Is everything okay? Why does everyone look sad?" Mitchell stepped forward, his expression softening as he looked at his granddaughter for the first time. Madison took an instinctive step backward, moving closer to David. "Madison," Mitchell said gently, "my name is Richard. I knew your mother, Sarah. She was my daughter, which makes me your grandfather." Madison's eyes widened and she looked up at David with confusion and fear. "Uncle David, I thought you were my only family now." "You have lots of family, sweetheart," David said carefully, kneeling down to her level. "Sometimes we discover family we didn't know about before." "Like when I discovered you?" Madison asked, her voice small. "Yes, like that." What happened next broke David's heart and simultaneously filled him with pride. Madison studied Richard Mitchell with the same careful assessment she'd given David on their first meeting. But this time, her conclusion was different. "Are you here to take me away?" she asked directly. Mitchell looked surprised by the question's directness. "I'm here to make sure you're being taken care of properly, Madison. You deserve the very best." "I have the best," Madison replied firmly. "I have Grammy Ruth and Grandpa Harold and Uncle David. They love me, and I love them. Are you going to love me too, or are you just going to take care of me?" The distinction between loving and taking care of struck everyone in the room silent. Even Victoria looked impressed by the 7-year-old's emotional intelligence. Over the next 2 hours, tensions escalated and de-escalated as Mitchell made his case for custody. David defended his position, and Madison sat quietly drawing at the kitchen table, occasionally looking up at the adults who were discussing her future as if she wasn't there. Finally, Victoria called for a break. "This is clearly a complex situation that won't be resolved today. Mr. Mitchell, you'll need to file proper paperwork if you want to pursue custody. Mr. Harrison, your guardianship petition is still being processed. In the meantime, Madison stays where she is, with the Petersons." After Mitchell left, with promises to return with lawyers, Madison climbed into David's lap, something she'd started doing when she needed comfort. "Uncle David, I don't want to go live with the man who doesn't smile," she said quietly. "He looks at me like I'm something broken that needs fixing." "You're not broken, sweetheart," David assured her. "You're perfect exactly as you are." "Will you fight for me?" Madison asked. "Like in the princess stories, where the prince fights the dragon to save the princess?" David looked down at this remarkable little girl who had already become the center of his world, who had taught him that love wasn't something you fell into gradually, but something that struck like lightning and changed everything in an instant. "Yes," he promised, "I'll fight for you. We're family, Madison, and families protect each other." That night, after Madison was asleep, David sat in Marcus's art room with Harold, Ruth, and Victoria, who had stayed to discuss the legal realities they were facing. "Richard Mitchell has advantages," Victoria said bluntly. "He's a federal judge. He has an impeccable reputation, and he can provide material advantages you can't match, Mr. Harrison. What advantages could he possibly provide that I can't?" David asked, confused. "Stability," Ruth said quietly. "You're a bachelor, David. You travel for business, you work long hours, you have no experience raising children. Mitchell has been married for 30 years, has raised children, and has a lifestyle that courts consider ideal for child rearing." "But Madison doesn't want to go with him," David protested. "The courts don't always prioritize what children want over what they think children need," Victoria replied, "and Mitchell hasn't shown his true colors yet. He was restrained today, probably because we were here. But federal judges don't get where they are by being gentle, David. If he wants Madison, he'll play to win." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. David might lose his niece, not because he couldn't provide for her, but because the legal system valued traditional family structures over emotional bonds. "There is one factor that might help," Victoria said slowly, as if reluctant to bring it up. "Courts do favor stable, two-parent homes. If you were married, or even seriously partnered with someone who could provide a maternal figure—" "I can't get married just to win a custody case," David said immediately. "No," Victoria agreed, "but if you happen to already be in a serious relationship, that would strengthen your position considerably." "Does she?" As Victoria left that night, David found himself thinking not about legal strategies or court cases, but about the way she'd listened to Madison with genuine interest, the way she'd defended the child's right to have a voice in her own future, and the way her professional mask had slipped when Mitchell had dismissed Madison's feelings as irrelevant. Victoria Chen wasn't just fighting for Madison as a social worker, she was fighting for her as someone who genuinely cared. And as David watched her taillights disappear down Maple Street, he realized that the solution to his legal problem might also be the answer to something he hadn't even realized he'd been looking for: a partner who understood that love and family came in many forms, and that sometimes the most important battles were fought not in boardrooms, but in modest living rooms, where little girls slept on cardboard and dreamed of families that would never leave them. The custody hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later, and David spent every available moment preparing his case while trying to maintain normalcy for Madison. What he hadn't expected was how naturally Victoria had become part of their daily routine. She'd started dropping by for follow-up visits that stretched into dinner, helping Madison with homework, and staying for bedtime stories. David found himself looking forward to these visits, not just because Victoria was Madison's advocate, but because she brought a warmth and understanding to their unusual family dynamic that felt essential. "Uncle David," Madison said one evening as Victoria helped her with a school project about family trees, "is Victoria going to be part of our family too?" David and Victoria exchanged glances over Madison's head, both aware of the growing connection between them, but uncertain how to address it with everything else at stake. "Would you like that?" Victoria asked gently. "Yes," Madison replied without hesitation. "She makes you smile differently than before, and she understands about families that aren't regular families." 2 days before the hearing, Richard Mitchell made his final play. He arrived at the Peterson house with a social worker from his own jurisdiction and a child psychologist he'd hired privately. "This is unconscionable," he declared, looking at Madison's cardboard bed, which David had deliberately left unchanged until the legal situation was resolved. No child should be living like this when alternatives exist. Madison, who had been coloring at her small desk, looked up with the serious expression she wore when adults were discussing important things she didn't fully understand. "Mr. Mitchell," she said politely, "would you like to see my drawings of my family?" Before he could respond, Madison had spread out several pictures she'd been working on. The first showed stick figures labeled Daddy in Heaven, Grammy Ruth, Grandpa Harold, and Uncle David. The second, more recent, included a fifth figure labeled Victoria, standing next to Uncle David. "This is my family," Madison explained proudly. "They take care of me, but more than that, they love me. Do you love me, Mr. Mitchell?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Mitchell looked at his granddaughter, this articulate, confident child who bore her mother's features, but had somehow developed a strength that neither Sarah nor Marcus had possessed. "I want to love you," he said finally, his voice less certain than it had been. "I loved your mother very much, and I see her in you. But you didn't love my daddy," Madison observed with devastating accuracy. "And I loved my daddy. If you can't love the people I love, how can you love me?" That evening, Victoria found David sitting on the Petersons' front porch, staring at the stars and trying to process the emotional complexity of the situation. "You know," Victoria said, settling beside him on the wooden steps, "in all my years of social work, I've never seen a child handle family trauma with Madison's grace." "She's remarkable," David agreed. "Sometimes I think she's handling this better than I am." "Can I ask you something personal?" Victoria's voice was careful, professional boundaries clearly weighing against her personal feelings. "Always. What happens after the custody hearing? Regardless of the outcome, what do you want your life to look like?" David considered the question, thinking about the past month and how completely his priorities had shifted. "I want to be Madison's uncle, whether that means being her guardian or just being present in her life. I want to live somewhere that feels like home instead of just an expensive place to sleep. I want to wake up in the morning and know that my first priority is being there for someone who needs me." "And personally, do you want to do all of that alone?" David looked at Victoria, seeing not just the professional social worker who had advocated for his niece, but the woman who had laughed at Madison's jokes, who had stayed late to help with homework, who had brought a stability to their lives that none of them had realized they needed. "No," he said quietly, "I don't want to do it alone. Victoria, I know the timing is complicated, and I know this situation makes everything more complex, but I need you to know that what I feel for you isn't just about the custody case. You've become important to Madison and to me in ways that have nothing to do with court proceedings." Victoria was quiet for a long moment, watching Madison through the living room window as she helped Ruth set up a board game. "I've been transferred," she said finally. "After the custody hearing is resolved, Madison's case will be closed and assigned to someone else for follow-up. My supervisor thinks I've become too emotionally involved." "No, have you?" David asked. "Yes," Victoria admitted, "completely and unprofessionally. I care about Madison as if she were my own daughter, and I care about you as more than just a client. If we lose the hearing, if Mitchell gets custody, I don't know how I'll handle saying goodbye to either of you." David reached for her hand, finding it warm and steady in his. "Then let's make sure we don't lose." The custody hearing took place in a sterile conference room that felt nothing like the warm, loving environments where Madison had grown up. Judge Patricia Hernandez presided, with lawyers for both David and Richard Mitchell presenting their cases. Mitchell's attorney painted a picture of traditional stability, a federal judge and his wife of 30 years, a large home in an affluent neighborhood, private schools, and every material advantage. David's attorney countered with emotional bonds. Madison's expressed preferences, and David's commitment to maintaining her current community connections. But it was Madison herself who ultimately decided the case. Judge Hernandez had requested to speak with her privately, and what transpired in that conversation remained confidential. However, when Madison emerged from the judge's chambers, she walked directly to David and climbed into his lap. "Uncle David," she whispered loud enough for everyone to hear, "I told the judge that families aren't made by rules or money. They're made by love and choosing to stay. You chose me and I choose you." Judge Hernandez's decision reflected Madison's wisdom. Guardianship was awarded to David, with provisions for gradual transition and ongoing support from the Petersons. Richard Mitchell was granted visitation rights, but only if and when Madison expressed interest in building that relationship. "Mr. Harrison," Judge Hernandez concluded, "this child has experienced significant loss and change in her young life. The court trusts that you understand the magnitude of the responsibility you're undertaking. Madison's well-being must always be your first priority." "It will be, Your Honor," David promised, holding his niece close as she dozed against his shoulder, exhausted by the emotional weight of the day. 6 months later, David stood in the kitchen of his new home on Maple Street, a modest 4-bedroom house 3 blocks from the Petersons, walking distance from Madison's school, with a large backyard perfect for a swing set and art studio. Madison was at the kitchen table, working on homework, while Victoria helped her with a particularly challenging math problem. Harold and Ruth visited daily, their health stabilized thanks to better medical care that David provided, while carefully preserving their dignity and independence. Madison still called them Grammy Ruth and Grandpa Harold, and they remained central figures in her life. Richard Mitchell had visited twice, awkward but genuine attempts to connect with his granddaughter. Madison approached these visits with cautious openness, willing to give him chances but clear about her boundaries and loyalties. "Uncle David," Madison called from the table, "Victoria says we need to practice our family presentation for school. Can you come help?" David joined them at the table, looking at the poster Madison had created showing her family tree. It was complex and unconventional. Grammy Ruth and Grandpa Harold occupied places of honor. Daddy Marcus was drawn with wings in a cloud. Uncle David stood at the center with a briefcase and a paintbrush. And Victoria was depicted holding hands with Uncle David while helping Madison with books and art supplies. "This is our family," Madison explained, her 7-year-old voice filled with pride and certainty. "It's not like other families, but it's perfect for us." Victoria caught David's eye over Madison's head, and the look they shared was full of love, gratitude, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing they'd all found exactly what they needed. Not what society expected or what appeared traditional, but what worked for their hearts. That night, after Madison was asleep in her new bedroom, with a real bed she'd helped pick out, though she kept her cardboard pieces in the closet for camping nights, David and Victoria sat on their front porch, planning their wedding and discussing Madison's upcoming 8th birthday party. "Do you think we got it right?" Victoria asked, leaning against David's shoulder as they watched their quiet neighborhood settle into evening peace. "I think," David replied, "we got exactly what we were supposed to have. Madison taught me that family isn't about perfection or meeting someone else's standards. It's about showing up, staying present, and choosing each other every single day." Inside the house, Madison slept peacefully in her real bed, surrounded by family photos, her father's paintings, and the security of knowing she was exactly where she belonged. Her cardboard bed was carefully stored in the closet, not forgotten, but transformed from necessity into memory, a reminder of the journey that had brought them all together. The little girl who had once slept on cardboard while dreaming of family had found something even better than her dreams. She'd found home.